this episode of Newt's World, the origins of the Memorial Day date back to 1868. Commander-in-Chief John A. Logan of the Grand Army of the Republic issued General Order No. 11, designating May the 30th as a Memorial Day, quote, for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country during the late rebellion and whose bodies now lie in almost every city, village, and hamlet churchyard in the land. In 1971, an act of Congress changed the observance of the holiday to the last Monday in May and extended the honor to all soldiers who died in American wars. Today, national observance of the holiday still takes place at Arlington National Cemetery, with the placing of a wreath of the tomb of the unknown soldier and the decoration of each grave with a small American flag. So while many Americans think of it as a weekend that marks the start of summer parades and backyard gatherings with family and friends, please also remember why Memorial Day was established: to honor those men and women who gave their life in service to our country and to protect our freedoms. As part of our Memorial Day episode, I wanted to invite back someone who is a true American patriot. He served in the Army National Guard for 2 decades until last month. He is a proud son of Minnesota, the author of American Crusade, Our Fight to Stay Free, and Fox and Friends Weekend co-host. I'm really pleased to welcome back my guest and good friend, Pete Hegseth. Pete, welcome back.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, thank you for having me. Always an honor. Appreciate it.
I'm curious because you have so many experiences, and I love watching when you're off at some breakfast place talking to people. You've probably talked to more everyday Americans than almost anyone I know. In your heart, what does it mean to you to have Memorial Day?
Memorial Day crystallizes it all for me. And you're right. When you're talking to everyday Americans, it's the type of day that means a great deal to them because they're still tethered to how precious our American experiment, this mission of freedom, really is. When I think of Memorial Day these days, and for many years, I ask myself, and I hope people ask themselves the same thing, am I living worthy of the sacrifice that previous generations gave at the altar of freedom? It's a gut check. It's a gut check that day, but also a reminder for the upcoming year that all the things that we have, all the opportunities we have here. Yes, we declared our independence with a bold document from brilliant minds, but it was the gritty men and women who were willing to pick up a musket or a rifle. It was the men and women who picked up machine guns and grenades and got on ships and deployed around the globe, knowing that when they left, they may not come home. And many of them have not. Millions of Americans over the course of time have sacrificed their lives so that we can live free. And when you realize our republic is not that old, it's young, 240 odd years young, and yet you look at the scope of the gift that has been given of human beings, human souls, Americans who were willing to die so that we can be here today, it encapsulates the gravity of this holiday that we have to work really hard to make sure our kids and grandkids understand and appreciate fully, that they know that it's more than a backyard barbecue. And I love the backyard barbecues and all the gatherings that happen. I think celebration is a part of what we should do for those of us who have our lives here in America today, is to enjoy it. But man, we better be drilling into the minds. I love the history that you read out at the beginning, Newt, about where this came from, what it was meant to recognize. And I've had my own special moments of Memorial Day, but each in our own way pass on to the next generation so they get the gravity of what it took to get us to this place.
I'm really curious because I've watched you for years, and you have a remarkable talent for speaking with people, for getting things down to a kind of common, everyday understanding. This clearly grew out of your very being. I mean, it seems to me that somehow when you were very young, you understood and you valued patriotism and you valued service. Where do you think that came from?
I got to give it to my family and to faith and to community. I mean, my mom and dad are just hardworking, everyday folks. My dad was a high school gym teacher and a basketball coach, and my mom stayed at home. And it wasn't an overtly political household, but it was patriotic. It was hardworking. It was truly rooted and invested in Christian faith, and just go out and be good people according to the gospel. And I'll tell you, there's a reason I'm a big believer in civic ritual, parades, fireworks, because I know that left a big imprint on my heart. And one particular example is a small town of Wanamingo, Minnesota. It's nowhere southern Minnesota. It's a small farming town. It's where both of my parents grew up. And they would hold parades throughout the year, but the biggest one in town was the Memorial Day parade. And again, I can't underscore how small a town this is, but they had a huge, wide main street. And they would have a Memorial Day parade, and the whole town would come out. We didn't live there at the time, but we'd always go back to our grandparents, stand by the side of the road, and it would be the line of veterans from that town with the band in front. And it's one of these blink and you miss it, Mr. Speaker. It's not long, but what you had was the entire town, hundreds of people standing as these vets, World War II vets, then Korean War vets, then Vietnam vets, and then you had Gulf War vets who, were young and still fitting into their uniforms, marching down that parade, and everyone would stand and revere them for their service. But of course, that parade ended at Memorial Park, where all those men and women in uniform would give honor to those who didn't make it home. And I remember they would read the names and talk about the lives of the people that were no longer there. And I don't know if it hit me then, but it certainly hits me now, but it left an imprint on me. Holy cow, this is tiny Wanamingo, Minnesota. And these are the list of names of people in this town and in the county who never came home. Imagine amplifying that across every small town across America. It started to give me a sense. I just as a kid watched the way the town revered those vets and those military members. And I thought, man, they've done something special, something bigger than this town, bigger than themselves. That seems really important to me. I didn't come from a military family at all. I couldn't tell you the difference between the Army and the Marine Corps when I graduated high school. I had no idea. So when Donald Trump talked about things like military parades, there's a reason why I truly believe in those things, and they need to happen because they're special events that you don't otherwise get in your life that remind you about the things that a society is supposed to value, back to basics of our military, of our flag. So recapturing those and doing more of that, I think, is truly important. But I benefited a great deal, Newt, from serving in the military. It's the best education I've ever received, is every background, every socioeconomic set, every race who was dedicated to something bigger than themselves. And, the other thing is I love doing the diners because just relating to people where they're at and hearing their stories and talking about the things that really motivate them and animate them. Part of my enjoyment of doing that is on deployments being stuck. You're stuck with 30, 40, 50 guys who you would otherwise never hang out with, who you didn't grow up with, and you are bored out of your mind half the time. And the only thing you have to do is to BS, is to chat and tell stories and to talk and find ways to relate to people who you otherwise wouldn't hang out with. In many ways, it was a forged opportunity because you spend so much time doing it, and then you end up appreciating it because those are not the type of people you meet in the Ivy League or in the media world or in politics. But the common sense wisdom that emanates from that, I think, has served me well.
That's really interesting. I have this imagery of you walking into a diner, and it's just like revisiting your platoon. And I must say, you connect. Every time I've seen you, usually at breakfast, you connect with people as well as anybody I know. Part of it is that they like Fox. Part of it is that they like you. But part of it is your style. You can be with almost any group, and you're curious about them. And I think they can sense that. They know when it's genuine and when it isn't.
Do you know how much I've learned, Newt, from those assignments? I truly enjoy it because the camera's on for 4 minutes, 3 times over the course of the show. But then you're spending 3.5, 4 hours with people. And it's always a different part of the country, a different kind of crowd. And you just sit down and say, how's life going? What are you facing? I don't know if you saw this, but I got mocked. I gave a CPAC speech and talked about these diners. And I talked about how people talk about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and the 10th Amendment. And it was broadcast, and a bunch of folks on MSNBC and CNN went nuts and said, oh, Pete Hegseth claims he goes to diners and talks about the 10th Amendment. And what they don't understand is, that, of course, is code for they talk about God and free speech and the Second Amendment and their right to bear arms. And of course, the idea of local control and states' rights. Those are the things they talk about all the time. And so we actually played a clip of diners talking about those things over and over and over again as we smacked back at them. But I do love it. They always say, hey, we feel like we know you, Pete. And I turn around and say, hey, I feel like I know you also, because there are a shared set of values of people who often show up at these things.
Well, you have to remember, though, if you're MSNBC, your idea of going to breakfast is either the Upper West Side or Rodeo Drive. And so you're thinking, I don't know anybody at Rodeo Drive who even knows what a constitution is. How can you be talking like this? I have to go back because, I used to be a historian in a different life. And so I try to think about things historically. You leave this small town, you go to Princeton, which is hardly a ground central for patriotism, and you end up joining the ROTC. Now, that's almost counterculture for Princeton. What got you across that bridge so you found yourself in the ROTC?
I almost went to West Point. Almost. I wasn't ready. Again, I didn't know the military well enough. And so I instead went to Princeton knowing they had a ROTC program. I actually signed up in May of 2001. So 4 months before 9/11, I joined ROTC, and then 9/11 happened. It was the ultimate validator. I knew I wanted to serve. That much I knew, for the reason I sort of mentioned briefly before. But then watching the forces on campus, watching the preemptive peace rallies at Princeton, as there was still smoke smoldering at ground zero, professors and students were saying, it's time for peace. And it's time to understand. And these people who attacked us, there's a rationale for it. We need to understand. And I remember scratching my head going, this doesn't make sense. Of course, it didn't make sense when the first Christianity course in the religion department from a so-called expert on Christianity, day one, they said, well, the most likely scenario is that Jesus was buried in a shallow grave and eaten by dogs, and the rest of it is just mythology. I had to go into the Firestone Library to read actual Bible history about apologetics of the history of it to fight back in class. I think the grounding was everything. And that's why I'm so focused now on K through 12, and we're doing a huge documentary in Fox Nation about the progressive, which you're a part of. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for taking the time to do that. And it's a 5-part series. It's coming together fantastic. I've learned an amazing amount. If you talk to Robbie George at Princeton, for example, the prominent constitutional professor who is one of my mentors there, and he'll say it used to be that the liberals would lick their chops when the kids would come to Princeton because they were ready to deconstruct their worldview that they showed up with. People like me would come in as these rube conservatives, patriots, and then they would contort them. And he said, now it's the other way around. Everyone shows up at Princeton already woke, effectively. And it is Robbie George who licks his chops at the opportunity to deconstruct the warped worldview they show up with. I've had my own, failings and mistakes and all of that, but coming back to the foundation of the way I was raised helped me get through that clear-eyed. And then joining the military, forget a degree from Princeton. The University of the 101st Airborne was way more educational for getting a sense of human nature, good and evil, and appreciation for America. And vets who get a chance to travel the world, you see the alternatives and you realize how special this really is, which makes it easy to make the case for it.
I have to say, by the way, just for a moment about ROTC. My dad went into World War II as an enlisted guy in the Army, came out, worked for the Reading Railroad, and got a GI Bill, went to Gettysburg College, was pre-med, but also joined ROTC and came out in the middle of the Korean War. And he found that serving in the uniform was so rewarding psychologically that he spent 27 years in the infantry. So I grew up in that world and surrounded by that really deep sense of service, which I think you get in organizations like the infantry, where you realize that you're going to be out there on your own and hopefully it's all going to work. So when we get to Memorial Day, one of the things I always think about is my father's role and also my mother's, because she was an Army wife and she went wherever he went. And times like when he was in Vietnam and Korea, she stayed home and took care of the kids and tried to balance the family checkbook because he was gone. And as you know, back in those days, gone meant really gone. You didn't have any of the modern capacity. So I often think of lessons I learned from my dad and from growing up inside the U.S. Army. Now, your unit went to Guantanamo Bay, where you served as an infantry platoon leader. What was it like to go to Cuba?
May I never go back. It was the longest year of my life, but I was also a new second lieutenant, and I had a platoon out of New Jersey, which was largely Hispanic and Italian, and they were almost all older than me, had been in the Army much longer than me, and here we were on a one-year deployment 90 miles from Florida, effectively, at a naval station, because the Guantanamo Bay is a naval station, where on the naval station side, it was an accompanied station. So you had sailors with their families and their kids, with schools in a grocery store and a PX and all of those things. And on the other side of the island, at the detention center at Camp X-Ray, and where we were as guards, we were living in tin cans, 6 guys for a year, lining up to use the AT&T phone to call home if we wanted to. So we may as well have been thousands of miles away, even though we were that close to the States. It was much like a deployment. There were 700 detainees there at that time, so it was still full. There were the MP guards that were actually in the cells. That was not us. We were on the towers and the gates, patrolling, mounted and dismounted. We were the quick reaction force into the facility. These are nasty, nasty dudes. And the things they would yell at the towers, the confrontations that we would have inside the jail cells, because they would have to call in the QRF. And I would often I had a Muslim member of my platoon who spoke Arabic, and I would stand in the tower with him for many hours, and he would sort of translate a lot of what was being yelled or what was being said. And it was not, I'm misunderstood, please let me go. It was threats to, if I find your name, if I find where you live, if I find your wife. Most of them were hardcore jihadists who sought our destruction, which is why the way in which Guantanamo Bay devolved into this sort of holding cell and releasing center of very little consequence, I think it was so underutilized in what it could have been. But it was a leadership year for me, learning how to lead men through largely the mundane. We had day shifts and night shift and all of that. And ultimately, thankfully, everybody, made it home just fine. But it was more of leadership in a regimented process away from their families. But I did appreciate it because it was post 9/11. It was an opportunity to be a part of it. And yeah, it was a long year.
Was the quality of that year, did that make it easier to volunteer to go to Baghdad?
Yes, because I
mean, you normally think Cuba, Iraq, but Cuba was so miserable that all of a sudden became, well, what have I got to lose?
That's kind of the case. Well, if I'm going to do this whole deployment thing, why don't we go to the main effort was a big part of the feeling. And I love the guys I served with in Guantanamo, but great men. In fact, one of the guys that I memorialize every year and think about is Jorge Oliveira, who was a specialist in my platoon at Guantanamo Bay, a National Guardsman who went back and became a police officer in his community, revered, and then deployed to Afghanistan, which is the third place I went, and was killed in Afghanistan on an ambush while I was not with him in that unit, but I was in Afghanistan at the same time he was killed. And he was just beloved by his troops and beloved by his department and lived a life of service. And he was one of my platoon members who was amazing at Guantanamo in what was done there. Yeah, I got home and it took a while to unwind, and then I was restless. I'll never forget, I actually worked for Bear Stearns in New York City and was watching the war unfold, having come back from Guantanamo Bay for a year because I was a guardsman. And I just got this abiding sense. In fact, it was a Wall Street Journal article that I read of a suicide bombing that killed a bunch of men and a bunch of children in Iraq, including a soldier. I remember thinking, I've got to do my part. I'm a trained infantry officer. I'm going to regret if I'm not in the middle of it as quickly as I can. And so I actually emailed the only guy I knew. He was a company commander in the 101st, and he had been my platoon trainer at Fort Benning. He had trained me as an infantry officer. And he wrote me back almost immediately. I'll never forget staring at the screen. It was like 15 minutes later. He said, actually, I need a second platoon leader. If you can get here, I'll take you. And I started the process of working through the Pentagon behemoth of a machine that doesn't move quickly ever. But ultimately, it came back to Princeton. There was a major general that had visited Princeton who had given me his card when I was a senior and said, if you ever need anything, shoot me an email. Well, it turns out he was now the commander of all forces in Korea. And I just emailed him thinking, what do I have to lose? Can he help the National Guard talk to the regular Army so that I can join the 101st for their deployment? And he must have known somebody, because I got a call one day at my trading desk at Bear Stearns, and it said, is this First Lieutenant Hegseth? And I said, yes. He goes, I don't know who the bleep you think you are, you better not bleep this up because your orders are going to the 101st Airborne. So I got my orders and went down to Fort Campbell and met my platoon down there just a few weeks before they mobilized to go to Kuwait. And a few weeks after that in Kuwait, we were in Baghdad. And I was the National Guard, Wall Street, Ivy League, non-Ranger qualified new platoon leader. I had a lot to credibility to gain because I didn't come in with many attributes a lot of my guys liked.
So you didn't actually go airborne?
I did not go airborne. Nope. I was not a airborne qualified.
But then you were taking on a lot.
Yes. Yeah. Imagine that. I had not had an opportunity to go to Ranger school or airborne school because I was in the National Guard. And I had, all these other parts of my background, but I knew my company commander had trained me and knew that he would love to have me as a platoon leader. And so a lot of it was him vouching for me and my viability. Now we did training and all of that. Obviously, once I got there, high intensity because he wanted to make sure I was caught up on all the TTPs and all the ways the unit operated. But at that point, the 101st Airborne it's actually not an airborne unit anymore. It's all air assault on helicopters. So really air assaults getting on and off and planning missions that way. It wasn't until our first night air assault raid against an Al-Qaeda target that went well, where we nabbed a bunch of them in Baghdad, that a couple of my staff sergeants came to me and they were like, all right, LT's okay. All right, you're okay. That's when you know you've got a shot.
Well, I was going to ask you a key question, I think, to understanding any military is, when did you learn to rely on your sergeants?
Oh, early, heavy. I mean, they drill it into you at your basic course that, hey, it's your platoon sergeant and your squad leaders that you're going to have to lean on. There's a lot of young LTs can still come in hard charging thinking they're the next Patton and, run into a brick wall. And I've always taken the opposite approach. Like, listen, you guys have been doing this. Yes, I'll ultimately be making certain decisions at certain moments, but my job is to bring different assets to bear to the battlefield. You guys are the ones closing with and destroying the enemy. My job is to make sure we've got air support and make sure we're coordinating with higher and with adjacent units on the radio, directing things, but also close enough to the front to make sure that I'm making the decisive choices. So early on, I had no choice. You have no choice. You can't show up at a unit like that or anywhere and pretend like you run the joint. You're very reliant. I still remember Sergeant First Class Godoy, my first platoon sergeant, took me under his wing and said, LT, here's how we do things around here. And it was a lot more listening than talking.
I think one of the greatest lessons I had learned was from my father about relying on the non-coms. And when I got to be a member of Congress, I very rapidly worked at figuring out who are the people who really make it work.
Yes.
And because I would pay attention to them, they responded wonderfully. And I got a lot of stuff done that you couldn't get done if you relied on yourself. The other lesson my father kept trying to drill into me, which I think you'll identify with, is that if the platoon leader starts shooting, you have added a rifleman and lost a leader.
Yes.
You've got to be very disciplined and only shoot on defense because you want all of your offensive thinking going on while other people are doing the shooting.
You're right.
Again, was one of those things where I didn't learn it quite as well as I should have, but it does make a huge difference to not get sucked into a fight that you should be directing and not participating in.
Absolutely right. And of course, the first time I was ever shot at, what's the first thing I did as a platoon leader? I started shooting back. Yeah. And it took a while for me to realize, no, I got to drop down in the turret here and start directing things.
You'll enjoy this. Duncan Hunter was a great supporter of mine in Congress from San Diego, ultimately ended up as chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Got to Vietnam, and big outdoor guy, bow hunting and all that stuff. And so he's there as a very young officer. He gets involved in his very first ambush. And they're gathered around the trail. They're waiting for I think it was Viet Cong at that point, to show up. And when they show up, he shows leadership by pulling a grenade off his vest and throwing it. And nothing happens. So he pulls a second grenade off, starts to throw it, and the sergeant leans in and says, if you pull the pin, they work better. and he ultimately ended up being a great combat leader, but he said there were those moments early on when you felt, like you're an idiot. When you look at the American military and compare it to almost any place else in the world, except maybe the Israelis, our ability to grow our non-coms so that they perform functions that in the old Soviet Army would have been done by majors and lieutenant colonels. And it gives us just a combat capability that I think sometimes on Memorial Day we should remember all the way down the line. All of these folks play a real role in our survival.
All the way down to the E5 lowest level non-commissioned officer who's leading a fire team, and he's maneuvering his 3 guys himself, that 4-man team. He is empowered to make decisions at that level, obviously all embedded, that are critical to any outcome. I can't even conceive of this sort of old autocratic way of organizing your military, which is like one officer giving a bunch of, plebes an order. It is the dynamic nature in which the American military and the Israeli military, as you talked about, can operate is all credit to a non-commissioned officer corps that polices itself. I mean, it's its own hierarchy as well, and complementary to what officers do.
I have to ask you, I think that what Fox Nation is doing, offering a free year to all active United States military members and veterans as a part of their Grateful Nation initiative, that's a big decision. They're putting a pretty good bit of money on the table, encouraging current military and veterans to look at Fox Nation and join it and get a year of free subscription. I just want to commend you because I know you're a part of this entire initiative, and I think you're probably as hard a charger inside Fox as you are outside on these kind of issues. But talk just for a minute about why you hope retired military and active duty military will see Fox Nation as something that really fits into their interest and their concerns.
I appreciate that. I'm really proud of Fox Nation for doing this, Fox News for doing it. It's the right thing to do, and I know they've seen a huge response so far, and it is that simple. If you're active military, Guard, Reserve, veteran, you can go to foxnation.com or foxnation.com/military, sign up for a free year. And I think what they're going to see is a streaming service that reflects their values. I mean, I've said it before, but it's worth reiterating. I mean, Fox Nation is the Netflix for conservatives, Christians, patriots, people that are looking for content oriented toward the family and history, real history. And so I think once they jump in there, they're going to find, whether it's the Modern Warrior series that I do, the documentaries in Israel, the stuff that Brian Kilmeade does on forgotten history, the unauthorized history of socialism or unauthorized history of taxation. I mean, there's so much great content there that you're never, ever going to see anywhere else, especially on a digital streaming service these days. And there's new content coming all the time. I mean, obviously the hope for Fox Nation is that these patriots who sign up for free for a year say, hey, I don't want to live without this, and they want to subscribe going forward. I think that will happen because the more people are exposed to the content on Fox Nation, the larger the catalog gets, and the bigger the names, and things are getting bigger every day. I think people will be drawn to it. We need that kind of alternative. There are these monster streaming services that just ram the same Hollywood content into our brains, and we need an alternative, and Fox is trying to grow that through Fox Nation, and this is a neat aspect of it. So I hope vets and military will take advantage of it.
So you have, I think, an upcoming Memorial Day weekend show from the Modern Warrior series, and as I understand, you're going to have a couple guys with you having a really interesting conversation. Can you talk briefly about how that show has been developed?
The show Modern Warriors was developed out of a frustration I had at Fox and Friends that you talk to these amazing war vets and you get 3.5 minutes and you know it's utterly insufficient. And so let's get them, in a bar or around a fire pit and get a beer in their hand and with other vets. And that's usually where you get the real story, the longer conversation, the deeper conversation. And so Modern Warriors is an ongoing series on Fox Nation. And we'll do it on the 4th of July. We'll do it on Veterans Day. We'll do it for Memorial Day. We'll do it just to do it. And we get different collections of vets. Usually it's Rangers and SEALs and Green Berets and infantrymen and aviators, just different backgrounds. And it's amazing. Sometimes they know each other, sometimes they don't, Newt. But when you get a group of vets like that from the post 9/11 generation and you just throw topics out there like Memorial Day or service or rules of engagement or woke military or withdrawal from Afghanistan or threats from China, you get an amazingly rich conversation. And this one in particular is called Modern Warriors Reflections. And it is almost all reflections on the gravity and weight and the meaning of Memorial Day. And we do it at the new National Veterans Museum and Memorial in Columbus, Ohio, which is beautiful, by the way. And it's very well put together. And you get candid conversation. Like, these guys get really honest. You can let the conversation breathe, go deeper into the topics. I also conceived this idea. I was supposed to meet Rob O'Neill, the guy that shot bin Laden, for one beer, just to chit chat and talk to him. Because we met at like 3:00. 4 hours later, and 10 beers later, I had the whole story of the bin Laden raid and his entire career. My mind was just swirling because I couldn't believe what an opportunity it had been to hear that story firsthand. And I wanted to get a little bit of that into people's lives, sit at the bar with Rob O'Neill and hear the real story.
I was at the museum in Columbus about 3 months ago, and I was really impressed with how modern it is, how well they've done at getting people to tell their stories. So you're really in direct contact with people who've done the real thing. And I commend anybody when you go to Columbus, that's a great museum and a great place for you to be doing this. Let me ask you one last thing, because I really appreciate you spending this kind of time with us. And I have to say, by the way, I used to spend time traveling with Ollie North. And in terms of your whole point, Ollie had been in so many fights in so many different places, both as a Marine and then later as a correspondent, and is such a great storyteller that you'd be sitting there with your jaw hanging open, as he said, and then this happened. And I think what it goes back to, in the Civil War, they had a phrase about whether or not you had seen the elephant. And what they meant by that was, had you been in combat? And this was always sort of my father's position, was that if you'd seen the elephant, you understood, and we didn't have to talk about it. And if you hadn't seen the elephant, you aren't going to understand anyway, and I'm not talking about it. And I think what you're doing is you're getting people together who've seen the elephant. And they're sharing, I think, with the rest of the country what it's been like, what it means. And I think it's a great service to the long-term health and long-term patriotism of the country. So I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. I'm really grateful you take this kind of time. I hope your new series really works, and I hope that veterans and their friends and relatives will realize that at Fox Nation they've got a real opportunity to sign up for a year and taste it, see what you think of it. And it's a great act of patriotism by Fox to make that kind of offer to those who serve with us. Pete, let me just mention one more thing. I understand that your book, American Crusade, Our Fight to Stay Free, just came out in paperback, and we're going to have a link to it at our show page so people can get it directly. Once again, you're a remarkably prolific guy. You work really hard, but you somehow seem really happy and positive through all of it, so it's great.
You know why? Because there was a book that influenced me a lot, written by Jeffrey Hardy, who's a professor at Dartmouth. I read it many years ago. It's entitled Smiling Through the Cultural Catastrophe. And I think that's... maybe that's how the spirit I try to have as things swirl around us. But Newt, you are a leader for all of us, and such a great patriot, such a great fighter, and I'm always honored to spend any time with you.
Thank you to my guest, Pete Hegseth. You can learn more about the Fox Nation promotion for active duty and military veterans on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Debbie Myers. Our producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.